I'd like to start off today's video with a little fact that probably is more of a shock to me than it is to any of you. And that is that I have now been making these woodworking videos for over a year. In the course of that year, I've made about 40 woodworking videos. And across those 40, there is one that stands out based on your views above all of the others. And that is this decorative box. It's some skilled woodworking, some laser cutting, and some epoxy inlay to create what I think is a pretty beautiful piece. And in that video, I made a contention at the very end that I did not prove, that I think maybe we should revisit. I said this: the amount of time and effort and skill that goes into something like this is probably something you couldn't recoup if you were to sell it. I'd like to make the focus of today's video an answer to that question. Can these boxes be made profitably? So I'm not going to just be making one box in today's video. I'm actually going to be making 10 of them. And building 10 allows me to work at a production scale. I should be getting all the efficiencies that I possibly can, both in material and my time costs, as I make all of the boxes together. And as I do that, I'm going to record precisely what my material costs are and how much time each step takes me. I'll take the best looking of the boxes that I create. I'll stick that one up on an auction on eBay for 7 days, and we'll see what the market value comes out. I have no idea what the outcome may be. I can give you a hint. In the first video where I made one of these boxes, it took me 2 weeks to make that box. In making all 10 of the boxes, it also took me 2 weeks to do. Now we can draw a couple conclusions from that. One, either I have gotten 10 times faster since that experience, or maybe you can make an infinite number of these boxes and it will always take 2 weeks. But more likely than that, that's just a sweet spot because there's so much time that goes into setting up of the glue and setting up of the epoxy that it's just going to probably take that amount of time. We're going to get a little more scientific than that. We're going to drill down to how much of my actual time is spent during those 2 weeks working on the boxes. And you are now going to go and see a past version of me putting all of these together while I get the auction all set up. And in the end, we'll find out what the results are together. The first cost to record, of course, is the wood material. And I bought 27 board feet of rough cut maple that was 1 inch thick. My price per board foot was $4.39, which led my actual cost to be $118.53, or $11.85 per box. Alright, now we get to build stuff. The first step in almost any building project is to mill down your rough cut wood. Now normally the easiest way to do this is to first cut it into lengths, the size that you're going to need to work with in the end. In the case of these boxes, however, we're only going to work with 8 inches, and that's a little bit of a safety issue on some of the tools. So instead what I'm going to do is cut it so that I can get 3 pieces out of each length, and then I'll take it over to be milled. Also, I think it's kind of cute that I'm keeping track of seconds at this early point in the project. You'll find out pretty quickly that those seconds are just going to become rounding error. I'm using a 12-inch jointer here, so some of these boards are actually thick enough to give me both my 8-inch top and bottom squares and also give me the 3 inches that I need for the sides. It can be tougher than it looks to get a board that thick through the jointer, and in the end it took me about 17 minutes to get all of that surfaced to 2 sides. The next step is the thicknessing planer. All of the boards are going to be flattened on the other side. The pieces for the lids are going down to their final thickness of 3/4, but the rest of them I'm going to keep as thick as possible, and you'll see why in just a minute. The last step in sizing the lids is to get them to their 8-inch square by cutting them on both the table saw and the miter saw. I hardly ever use the safety clamp on the miter saw, though it is helpful for some cuts. In this case, I'm using it as a stop block to make sure all of my cuts come out the same. I keep going with that until I have 10 lids to work with. Now the reason I kept a lot of the boards thicker is that I actually need to resaw them down. The bottom of the box is only about 3/8 of an inch thick, and I need a 1/4 inch or so piece to help me with the lid. So I'm going to try and get that out of a single board. Once resawing, a trip through the planer, the table saw, and the miter saw. Get the top and bottom pieces to their final dimensions. I needed 10 tops and bottoms, but I'm going to need 40 pieces for the sides. And while I want 1/2 inch thick sides, I actually want to do it out of 2 different pieces, so I need to resaw those as well. And it is significantly easier to resaw some 3-inch sides on the bandsaw than it was to do the 8-inch tops. In fact, doing the 4 sides took a little less time than just doing one top piece. While I rarely show it in my videos, I do make an awful lot of trips back to my dust collector. And in this case, I had something informative there. Now that we're getting to the end of the road of the milling and dimensioning process for all of our pieces, we can start adding up all the time it's taken to get to here. And I will admit, these results were a little surprising to me. In the end, the actual work that I had done counted up to about 11 minutes per box. And I guess it just felt a little longer than that. Well, I've reached the first major milestone in the build, and that is dimensioning out all of this lumber from the rough cut wood that we had before. And this represents 10 boxes, but let me show you how that breaks down into individual boxes. This would be the top, the lid of the box, and this piece goes with it. We'll show you how that works in a minute. The base of the box goes here. These thicker sides kind of make up the foundation of the sides that give it its strength, and these thinner ones will make up the decorative element of the sides, and they're the ones that are going to be laser cut in just a minute. Now, fortunately, the work that I can do can break up and be done in parallel now. The machine can start working on the cuts on these little delicate pieces, while I can do the work carving out the top so it's ready to be laser cut as well. Let's start with the laser cutting. The best way that I've found to laser pre-cut pieces is to first etch the outline into some construction paper to give you a way to place the pieces precisely, and then do the actual cutting. Cutting solid wood like this generates quite a bit of smoke, but I think you can get an idea of the pattern that's being cut into these. While that cutting is going on with the laser, I turn my attention over to making a router jig so that I can hollow out the top of the lids. Now, I make my own router base plates, and using a custom base plate to fit the job that you're doing has opened up a lot of new worlds to me in woodworking. In this case, I'm using my large square size, which is 10 inches by 10 inches, and it'll allow me to cut out a really big pocket while still staying on top of the edges. And if you ever have a job that would be helped by having a custom router base plate, you might want to go check out my Etsy store, which is linked down in the description. I'll probably have something there that could help you. Now, I will say in hindsight that I would have done this a little bit differently. What I'm doing here is cutting out the full dimensions of what I want the recess to be. But if I were to do it again, I'd actually come inset by about 1/8 of an inch, cut out all of those dimensions using this jig, and then go back later and use a flush trim bit against an acrylic template in order to get my final dimensions. And the reason why I say that is because I found no matter how tight I got this, I still got just a little bit of play inside of my jig here, and it made it difficult to keep the edges straight. Now, I feel a bit of an obligation to take a minute and explain this next part, because for those of you who didn't see me make this box in the first video, you won't know that I came close to burning my shop down doing this next step. And the reason for that has to do with not being as careful as I needed to be on the laser cutter. What I want to do on the laser cutter now is to cut into the top of this box a pattern similar to the one that I've done on the sides. The interesting thing about this, though, is that it's a hollowed out box. And so there's this cavity beneath it. And the natural thing to do is to set it into the laser cutter and cut it from the top. Well, what ended up happening when I did that was that I was cutting these little pieces out, and most of them would then fall down. There was nothing there to stop them. They would fall, hit the bottom, and scatter a little bit. And when the laser came on to a bordering piece that hadn't been cut out yet, it would go through the wood at the top, and it would strike the piles of wood that were building up beneath it, and those would start on fire. Now, I eventually did get through that cutting process in that video, but in order to do that, I had to have water nearby and a little squirter, and I would just, every minute or two, I'd be opening up the laser, putting that fire out, restarting the job, and coming back again. That's not what you want to do when you're lasering things. It's just not safe enough. If you watch that video, you will also know that even though I did get through that part for the laser cutting there, I later screwed up the top of the box so badly that I had to go back and do it again. And my solution to that problem was to create a little board that I could stick inside of this cavity here. And when I put it in to cut, it would be there and it would just hold those pieces in place. I could do that again, but I've got a little more experience laser cutting now. And I realized I could actually cut it this way. If I cut it this way, I have to invert the image on the computer before I do it. But that's not too hard to do now that I know that software a little bit better. So that's what I'm going to do this time. I'm going to put these in upside down and have it cut with a mirror image of what I want on the front side. It should turn out just fine. All right, so remember that thing I just told you a second ago about being more experienced with lasers? Well, throw that out the window because this is what just happened. Now, obviously, I've got some good cuts going right here, but that was unexpected. That is the result of a fire. So yes, if you're paying attention, I have now discovered across 3 cuts 2 different ways to burn my shop down by cutting a cavity like this. So let me explain what happened. I had forgotten that there is a feature on a laser cutter just at the bottom of where the unit that shoots the laser itself down into the material, there is a little fan that blows across it, and it's called the air assist fan. Well, when I'm cutting into a cavity like that, this part of the wooden piece here is actually blocking the air coming from the air assist fan. And because that wasn't happening, the laser caught it on fire despite it not falling into any cavity. Fortunately, I was here in the room like it asked me to be. The manufacturers of these lasers tell you be there while the laser is doing its cutting, and I saw the flames coming up and I put it all out. But don't risk things like this. We're going to go back to plan B from the last video, which is to take an insert like this on the new plates that I'm going to be cutting out here. We're going to stick that insert in and cut it from the top so the fan can blow across it the whole time. What are you going to do? I'll get back to cutting. That's what I'm going to do. Fortunately, you can learn from me. It's not a great view through the smoking glass here, but I was paying close attention to it, so I thought I'd show you what the laser did too. The pattern came out great, and here's all the pieces that were left behind, which is also kind of a fun pattern too. But unfortunately for those pieces, they are destined for the trash. Now meanwhile, while the laser is cutting out the tops, I'm beginning the preparation that's needed to glue the pieces together before we can put in the final epoxy colors. I do this glue up of the layers together with epoxy also, but it's done with a clear epoxy. The reason I use this epoxy is it turns out to be the best seal for keeping in the colors between the cells later on. The drawback, of course, is that this is a kind of glue that needs 24 hours to set up before you can do anything else. I'm counting neither the glue up time nor the machine time towards my totals, but here are those totals so far. All right, so we've come to the second major milestone, and that is that we've got all of the shapes cut out with the laser cutter onto both the sides, which has 2 different patterns, and onto the top, which just has a single pattern. In addition to that, I've got all of the backings epoxy glued onto both the sides and on the tops, which means we're ready to work on filling these little cells in with the colored epoxy. Now I know that through the magic of video editing, it's probably only been 2 or 3 minutes since I announced the first major milestone, but for me it's been about a week, and you might be able to tell that by the new haircut that I got in the meantime. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that I only have so many. I have about 30 of these spring-loaded clamps, which limited the amount of gluing that I was able to do at one time. And the epoxy takes 24 hours to set up. Now, I was able to take the clamps off after about 8 to 10 hours, which meant that I got 2 sets in each day. That still adds up to a lot of time. In addition to that, with the fire that happened inadvertently, and by my mistake, in the laser cutter, I ended up burning through one of the belts on my laser, and I had to go order a replacement part and then install that before I could actually cut out all the rest of the tops. Remember, this was my first attempt. So I had to cut those out and get it glued to get us to the point where we are right now. But fortunately, we are in the spot where we can start filling in the colored epoxy in here, which I think is probably going to be the most time-consuming step. And it's one of those you just can't take a shortcut on. I tried that in the last video and it didn't turn out well. So each time we put a color in, we're going to have to wait another 24 hours for all of that to set up before we get into the color after it. See how that goes? I'm going to start getting to work laying all these out on the table and starting to spread in the epoxy. There are 3 colors that I use for these epoxy inlays. Red for the flowers, blue for the sky, and green for the leaves. I'm going to start with the red, and I'm doing it a little bit differently than I did last time. In that box I just used a dye, but in this case I'm going to use the combination of a dye plus some mica powder. Now in that first video I got 2 pieces of feedback over and over again. The first bit of constructive feedback was that I had the background music volume up a little too high and people couldn't hear me talking. Well, hopefully I've learned a little bit better how to mix audio since then. The second one is that I should be using a syringe to put this epoxy into the inlay holes, and not this popsicle stick-like thing that I'm using. Well, I took that second bit of feedback to heart, and in several projects since I tried the syringe method. And the truth is I just don't like it. I actually think you get a lot more control using this popsicle stick method of mine, and I'm sticking to it. As you can see, there was a lot of red to do, and I had to go back several times to refill the cup I was working from. Fortunately, each time I was keeping track of how many drops of dye and just how big of a scoop of the mica powder I was putting in to make it all consistent. Now, as we go on from here, you may notice that one box is not quite like the others. And the reason for that is that my wife likes purple roses, and her birthday's coming up, so the unique box is going to be for her. The second color is the blue for the sky. I have to treat this color differently than I did the red. The cells that I'm pouring into are much more spaced out, so I can't just pour it in, I have to drip it in with my stick. So while blue had the least amount of area, it took me the most amount of time. And to give you a sense of how much time that was, I have sped this track up 16 times in order to fit it into this video. But it sure looked good when it was all done. The last color was the green for the leaves. Now the green takes up the most amount of area and that's the most amount of material, but it was by far the fastest for me to put on. Because there were no more cells other than green to fill, I didn't have to worry about getting excess green anywhere. That let me just pour it on as quickly as I could mix it. And in the end, you are going to get a little bit of overlap of the colors, but it's all happening above the surface of the wood, and you're going to sand it all back down to get it right later. Now I'd like to share with you one little tip. And this is a tip that I've used on all 3 colors here. And it's a tip that we need because sometimes we're not perfect in putting that backing onto the top face that has the pattern cut into it. And it leaves little pinprick holes, and the epoxy in its real thin form can go right through those holes, leaving you with empty cells. Now the way to get around that, I found, is to just simply leave yourself a little epoxy after your pour and let it sit for a few hours. Once you do that, you don't have a thin epoxy anymore. You have something thicker like this that you can work with and kind of push them into the holes. One last tip, don't run out of epoxy, have enough on hand. I've got to add another day to my build here because I'm going to have to go get some more epoxy to fill the last few cells in. Final totals for time on doing the epoxy, a bit over 4 hours for the red, more than 5 hours for the blue, and just over an hour for the green. All right, I'm at my third and final milestone before we get to the very end of the project when it's all done. So the last time I'll interrupt you. It took quite a bit of time to put all of this epoxy in, but it looks pretty nice. It's got this nice, clear, glossy finish. The problem with it, of course, is that it's sticking up too far. It's not a nice, flat, level surface, and it's got little gloopy spots all over the place. We have to fix that by sanding. The other thing that I'm going to need to do before I get into the woodworking is I need to clean up these areas where it leaked through. Got some of those on these and even on these. So I'm going to have to come up with a few techniques to clean all of that up. Then we'll miter the edges, put the boxes all together, and it'll all be ready. Sounds like fun. Now this part of the process shows a really clear case of how your techniques change when you're doing something in mass. If you're making a single box and just have 4 side surfaces to sand and a top, then it's not too big of a deal to just bring out your hand sander and take care of everything. It's kind of like that jig I used for the router. It just doesn't really seem worth it when you're just going to use it for one piece. But when you're looking down at a table full of sides, it definitely becomes worth it in your mind to go ahead and glue all of those sides with this hot glue here down to a single board so that you can take it through a machine. Which is precisely what I did. If I were to feed these through one at a time through the sander, it just really wouldn't work out well. They'd start popping out at different angles and the sanding wouldn't be flat. But this piece of plywood solves that problem for me, both by giving me a surface to attach a lot of these sides to at once, but also giving me something long enough to work in my sander. I am, however, sufficiently lazy that I don't want to change the belt inside the sander to go higher and higher in grit. So once the drum sander has done the hard work for me, getting all of that uneven epoxy down to a nice flat layer, I will use the hand sander to go up in grits until I go from 80 grit to probably 500 and make it nice and smooth. Even with all my mass production speed ups, the sanding still took quite a bit of time. Another really clear example of where mass production changes the way you think about things is cutting the miters on the sides of the boxes. In the first video where I did just one box, I think I showed at least 5 different ways that you can cut the miter into the box side, and I pointed out the good and bad of those various ways. Even when going through all of those different techniques though, I didn't even consider the idea of making a table saw sled to do this job. And yet with 80 cuts to do, it seemed like the only way to do it. I'm afraid it's a whole nother video to go through all the things I like and don't like about putting a table saw sled together. So let me just say that if you want to do woodworking, it's definitely one of those techniques you just need to have ready to use. The glue up process, on the other hand, didn't really change. I really couldn't think of any good way to optimize it in mass production. The painter's tape is there both to help me in creating the box shape itself and to keep some of the excess glue from spreading around. Otherwise, it's the standard spread the glue around and clamp it tight together and wait. And then finally, there is the satisfaction of putting the finish on and getting that shine to come back out on that epoxy inlay. You'll notice that I'm doing the purple one first, and that's because my wife's birthday is sneaking up pretty quickly here, and I can't wait for all the gluing to be done to get this particular box done first. Eventually though, I did get the gluing done on all of the pieces, and then I was able to finish them all. The final step in assembly is to get the hardware all in place. And I thought it'd be a little bit nicer to recess the hinges. The Shaper Origin gives me a simple and repeatable way of getting that accomplished. With the boxes all done, it's time to conduct my experiment. So the next step was to put it up on auction on eBay, and then wait 7 days. But you can see the results right now. Well, I've come out to my reflecting chair, and that's just a chair I made from some leftover materials from this pergola I built and attached to my barn. But it is a place where I can step away from the shop and think about the way things have gone and what I need to do next. Now, I recognize before I tell you that I owe you some numbers. The first is that the material cost of this box came out to just about $15 per box. And that includes the wood, the epoxy, the resins and dyes, and the hardware that went into it. That number wasn't all that surprising, but what was a little bit more surprising to me was the time. When I added it all up, it came up to just about exactly 2 hours of my time to put together one box. And that was just incredible to me. It feels like so much more time than that when it takes you 2 weeks to put this together. And I guess when you're doing 10 of them. But I don't think the stopwatch lied. I do believe that's about the amount of time it took to build this. Now the big question you're probably asking is how much did it turn out to be in terms of cost? What is it that is really the market value of this? Now, I told you back in the very beginning of the video that my way of determining this I thought would be scientific as well. I'll stick it up in an auction on eBay and let the market decide. Well, there's a little problem with that. I did do all of that. I put it up there, I let it sit there for 6 days out of the 7 I had in the listing. And not only was there 0 bids on it, but there was also only 2 people that even viewed the listing. And I know that there's no way to determine a market value just on the impression of 2 people. So that plan did not work. I had to come up with something else. And while I don't know eBay all that well, I'm more used to its old model than its current one, I do know Etsy really well. I have a successful Etsy shop, and I'm going to instead try and list this up on Etsy and figure out its value there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the price very high. I'd say my time is worth $100 an hour. And I'll set the price to that amount, stick it up in my Etsy store and see if it sells. If it doesn't sell, that's okay. I'll wait a little while, I'll drop the price down, and I'll see if it sells at that price. And I'll keep doing that until I get to a level where these start to sell again. Now, in order to do that, I do need to do a little bit of advertising for it, which isn't really my strength. But I think I'm going to use this video as part of that mechanism. So that means, unfortunately, I can't tell you in the video itself what I've determined the market value to be. So what I'll encourage you to do is take a look down into the video description. If it's still up for sale, you'll find the link to the Etsy listing where you can, if you're interested, either look at that listing or get one for yourself. There's only a limited number of these, of course, so they will disappear. And when they've disappeared, then I'll have a better sense of what they could sell for. And I will put that number down in that description as well. So you'll either see a link to the listing or you'll see the result of what I think this box can sell for. So while it really didn't turn out the way that I expected, it never really does. And I did learn quite a bit about the different techniques it takes to build something like this when you're doing a lot of them compared to just the one that I did in my previous video. I hope you liked that too. If you'd like to support this channel in any way, I'd encourage you, one, if you're interested, go take a look at the listing for the box. But if not, and you liked what you saw here, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. Not only does it help you get to be able to see more of my future builds, but it also helps other people get to see the videos that I make. With that, I think that we're done for today. I know it didn't turn out exactly the way that I wanted, but I got a lot of cool boxes out of it, and there will be a lot of neat builds in the future as well. I hope to see you there.